So can we fix Britain? I don't know if anybody still listens to Radio 4's Today programme. I occasionally do, and then it'll get to a story and I'll switch over to Talk TV or something. But I was listening to it last week, and the announcer made a point that the Collins Dictionary had announced that the word of the year was permacrisis. Yeah. I mean, it's a fitting word, isn't it, for 2022, when the headlines have been full of crises, from homegrown problems in the NHS to worldwide concerns about climate emergency, and even, as we know from our experience getting here, rail strikes and all the rest of it. But even if things haven't been described as a crisis, things do look chaotic, not just on our kind of rail networks. In fact, one of the speakers who had to pull out because he couldn't get here, he had to get back to somewhere in the southwest. He said it was the third event of the year he'd been unable to go to speak at because he couldn't get there. So it does feel like we're in a sort of perma-crisis situation, or certainly things are very chaotic. Things don't seem to work as well as they did. And not just because of the pandemic. But is that right? Is Britain really broken? Or parts of it broken? Is this sort of part of a worldwide phenomenon? Or is it a kind of, are these words like crisis and emergency and permacrisis, are they kind of hyperbole? Are they kind of alarmist? Are they sort of part of that thing that Claire was talking about to kind of dampen our enthusiasm for fixing things? Can we fix them? Who could we fix them, and how? So look, I'm really delighted to introduce our panellists who, as I say, will offer some thoughts on that and hopefully come up with some ideas of whether or not we can fix Britain. They have got, if you go to our website, they've got, very grand and long biographies, all of them, but I'm just going to introduce them very quickly with a short biography. And I will introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak. So first of all, on my far right, as it were. Professor James Woodhousen, who is visiting Professor of Forecasting and Innovation at London South Bank University. On my far left, we have William Clouston, who is party leader of the Social Democratic Party. On my immediate left, we have Sherelle Jacobs, who is a columnist at the Daily Telegraph. And finally, on my immediate right, Hilary Salt, who's an actuary and founder of First Actuarial. So can we give them a round of applause, please? James.
Well, good morning, everybody. Great turnout, lively-looking faces. I want to begin by a very serious warning. Dr. Elliot, I should say, at St Andrews University, Scotland, has said that we've got a real problem that could happen tomorrow, which is, how do we greet aliens if they land? And he didn't mention whether we should ask them, first of all, their preferred pronouns, as they do all of this. But I could have told him that the aliens have already landed in the shape of Jeremy Hunt. So... But if you look at Hunt and you look at these people, I think what's striking to me as a renegade physicist is that we have technocrats, as Claire so eloquently said, who know nothing about technology. That is really a problem for us. And I hope you'll forgive me if I dwell on technology a little bit. I met Sir Keith Joseph, some of the older people will remember, a long time ago, the Mad Monk. And I said, look, I'm editing a magazine by the name of Design, Sir Keith, and it's published by your Department of Trade and Industry. Can you give me an interview? And he said broadly, no. He said, it was really bulgy. I don't know much about design, except that it's terribly, terribly important. And that really sort of sums up Boris and everybody else about technology and innovation. You know, they're all for it, if only they knew what it was. Now, I think, apart from aliens, scams have come to my notice. Smart meters, £150,000 people have been switched to expensive prepayment meters remotely without being asked so that they can pay more. Smart roads, a coroner recently said when a 62-year-old Asian woman by the name of Begum was run over on the bit that, isn't the hard shoulder, she said the coroner said there was a lack of public understanding about smart roads. So it's your fault when you get run over, not the Highways England or anybody like that. When we think of scams, I'm also thinking of the £7.4 billion worth of research and development, R&D tax credits. Just recently, 8 men were arrested having scammed it for £16 million, having been engaged in, and it was waved through, coming up with innovations such as recipes for BlackBerry croissants, and the design of vegan menus. Now, I've got nothing against BlackBerry croissants, blueberry ones. But what's really striking about the tax credit thing is not only that it took 130 HMRC agents to arrest 8 men, what's also striking is that £84.4 billion worth of tax credits are unclaimed in this country. Perhaps it was a lack of public awareness or understanding. Your fault, again, that you didn't claim it. And the final scam is, since net zero has come in, there's been an 85% increase in fraudulent cold calls to older people offering Gordon Brown's amended programme for their homes, insulation, insulation, insulation. And they also go door to door, these people. So we've got these scams, we've got these warnings about things that could happen tomorrow, the aliens landing. And the other thing I think that comes out of both of these is a sort of risk-averse, scammy media, which is so worried about public expenditure that just this week, and Claire has commented about this on her Twitter feed, we have learned that Sizewell C in Suffolk, the 2 gigawatt, 3 gigawatt nuclear reactor plan for there since 2010 is under review. It now appears faintly that it's not going to be cancelled, but you don't know, because even if it was let through today, we know, given the U-turn phenomenon, it could be cancelled tomorrow. So I want to say that can we fix Britain? Yes, there are 3 things that are important. Numeracy. It would be nice if the Committee for Climate Change knew anything about direct current and science, since there are 2 cables planned from Wilhelmshaven in Germany and also Morocco, both 2 gigawatts each, which don't have transmission losses. The Moroccan cable is actually something that will need £90,000 worth, 90,000 tons of steel to build, but it's coming from a solar power site in Morocco, so it's got to be good, and we'll make the 90,000 tons of steel, won't we, through heat pumps and solar power and all the rest of it. We don't seem to know these basic numbers. We're not told, nobody in government has talked about the merits of direct current, which doesn't have the transmission losses that alternating current has. So numeracy in the scientific sense, I think, is important. The second one is, if I can just get this to work, and I know we're all right for time, literacy. I want to tell you, does anybody in here understand contracts for difference at the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy? CFDs? Let me tell you what they say about administrative strike prices for gas-fired energy. And this is in a 4,400-word document, 4,400 words, about how they do the accounting methodology. Administrative strike prices, ladies and gentlemen, represent the maximum strike price that the government is willing to offer developers for each renewable technology type, otherwise known as the reserve price. Should there be sufficient bidders for an auction to be triggered, the clearing price, the price paid to the successful projects, is set by the bid made by the last project allocated a contract before the auction closes, subject to no project receiving a higher strike price than its technology-specific ASP. Did you get that? Right? That's what the civil service, and that's 4,400 words of that document. Now, it can't just be down to me, some poor sap, to read this stuff. You've got to read it in order to fix Britain, because we need to combat them with numeracy, literacy, democracy. And unless we mobilise the people for a better Buxton-centred, local-orientated, but nationally coordinated plan for growth, better than Liz Truss, then we really are in trouble. We can't just attack the usual suspects like Elon Musk and Jacob Rees-Mogg. We've got to come back at them with numbers, with ideas, with literacy, and finally, ladies and gentlemen, with magnanimity. That's what we'll be displaying at this debate today, the willingness to listen to the other side, see the bright side in what they say, be generous, forgive, and get on with fixing Britain. Thank you.
I'm going to remain seated, you won't hear me. Can we fix Britain? Yes, I think we can, but it'll take time. I'm actually going to attempt the impossible here. In 6 minutes, I'm going to outline the problem, diagnose the cause of the problem, and suggest a cure. So first, the problem. We've mistaken debt-fueled consumption for prosperity. They're very different. We've replaced an economic model we used to be based on production with one based on debt. Briefly, we save too little, we invest too little, we produce too little, but we consume too much, particularly on imports. There are many symptoms of this. I'll give you a few. The government hasn't balanced its budget in over 20 years. The national debt is higher than it's ever been. We have a massive trade deficit. We haven't had a positive balance of trade in goods since 1985. No one will talk about this, least of all the people that caused it. Household debt is rampant, and corporate debt is also rampant, no different. In our big cities, manufacturing basically has been replaced by an unsustainable Ponzi scheme, otherwise known as the University Industrial Complex. That is something which replaced something that was based on production with more debt, student debt. So look at a city like Sheffield. It used to have 70,000 people working in the steel industry. It's got more than 70,000 students. That's not a fair swap. The debt binge has basically lasted 30 years. We face a major crisis now because it's about to stop, because the era of cheap money is over. And that's going to be a serious problem for us. Debt is being repriced. So that's the problem. What caused the problem? I think the root of the problem is rooted in bad ideas. Let me run through a few of these bad ideas. The deification of free markets, a preference for the global over the familiar, an indifference to what is made where and by whom, even if it's made by slaves, and a stubborn refusal to plan. In fact, the demonization of planning in general. And what I'm basically describing here are the hallmarks of a type of economic liberalism, you might call it. There are many words for it. But like holidays that end before they finish, I think this type of neoliberal thinking is at its end. And I think probably Liz Truss is possibly the death spasm of this type of thinking. I think it has no solution to the national problems we have. It has nothing to add on geopolitical challenges either. And I think the public will demand, and in the end they will get, secure supplies of power and food and other essentials. And I mentioned planning. I'm keen on planning. I want to use two examples to illustrate what I mean. Energy policy. We needed a nuclear power industry 20 years ago. Some of you may have seen the clip of Nick Clegg. We needed it 20 years ago. What we got was an illegal war. That was what we were given. And reflect on this. The energy bailout that we're just seeing now could cost 100 billion. You could get a domestic nuclear industry for that would provide basically half your power. Lunacy. A failure to plan is very, very costly. I think basically my case is that we're living through industrial decline based on cultural problems, cultural decline. and we won't solve one without the other. Let me just say a few words about housing, massively important. We need, in my opinion, we need a national state house building programme. The coalition basically didn't lay a brick. There was a little bit, didn't lay a brick. Not interested in seriously dealing with it. When they could have borrowed at 1%, they didn't build social housing that would have yielded at 3.5%. That's the yield on social housing, even at social rents. Crazy. It actually costs them not to build. Madness. And it's this objection to planning which is the problem. My real point about this is that the decline, I think, doesn't consist in not building the nuclear power stations or not building the houses or not training the doctors. It consists in not wanting to. And we won't solve any of our problems until we want to solve the problems. So the cure. I could have given you a list of policies, policy ideas on investments, public investments and other things, but that's not really the answer in my case. I think the root of our problems are cultural, and I think the solutions must therefore be cultural. The SDP published a green paper last year called The End of Indifference, because basically our case is that you won't fix Britain's problems unless you deal with this problem of indifference. In other words, you won't solve the housing crisis until we care about it, until we care about the fact that young people can't find a home to raise a family. You've got to care about it first and then deal with it. You won't reindustrialize until we care about what is made, where, and by whom. Basically, you've got to think about that. You won't reindustrialize without it. You won't also solve your trade deficit without caring about that. And you won't solve the energy crisis without caring about where power is generated and by whom. So a lot of the questions, I often ask the question, what would Clement Attlee think of this? And it's something I would apply to, what would Clement Attlee think of the French building our nuclear power? I don't think he'd be very impressed. You won't solve the NHS staffing crisis until you care enough to train enough doctors and nurses here and not steal other people's. And you won't have a national railway system worth pride in it until you care about who runs it. At the moment, the French and the Dutch and the Italians run it with mixed results, but we don't care about it. We don't even care about where the trains are made. If you care about it, you might actually solve some of these problems. I'm going to finish off with a quote. The solutions to our problems are rejected not because they're difficult, but because they are simple. That's Richard Tawney. I think he's right. I'm not saying they're easy, but they are often very simple. The solutions are rejected, I think, because the people who govern us are indifferent to things that matter, and they are ideologically opposed to state action in key areas. That's why it doesn't happen. And my prediction is that that is going to change, and I think it's going to change quite quickly. Thank you.
Well, I think the first obvious thing to say is Britain really does seem to be broken. We do seem to be stuck in this neoliberal doom loop whereby absolute sovereignty belongs to financial capital rather than people and democracies, and that has led to an over-capitalized economy, over-reliant on financial services, which is prone to systemic risk. And those implosions are always solved, seemingly, by austerity. And on top of that, we have many aspects of our society which seem to be fundamentally broken, and there are no technocratic solutions. Immigration is one really big example at the moment that people are focusing on. I would say things like Brexit and the Northern Ireland Protocol are other good examples of this. And we need to recognise how bad it is in terms of the fact that, let's face it, populism does seem to have crashed and burned somewhat. Populism Mark I. Boris Johnson has been ousted. He's been replaced by Rishi Sunak, the technocrat. Obviously, over the pond in the United States, Trump also has been replaced with Joe Biden. Instead of levelling up meaty infrastructure projects, it looks increasingly like we're going to be left with sort of roadside flower beds and hanging baskets. No control over our borders, despite the fact that this was one of the promises of Brexit. And I think looking back there were some fundamental weaknesses with the populist revolution, as it were. It lacked a coherent philosophy. So was Brexit about freedom, or was it about taking back control? I think that this tension, this philosophical tension, was never really dealt with. There was a lack of tight policy ideas. Instead of one Dominic Cummings, we needed 1,000 Dominic Cummings, thinking about all sorts of things, from education to how do you reform the NHS to immigration. It's not enough to have one person with some quite interesting ideas. And the Tories were not really the right vehicle, I don't think. I think that the Tories have a lot of baggage. They have a lot of ideological baggage, and I think that they are still, to a large degree, a party of vested interests and NIMBYism, and that does really hold them back, and that's to do with the various seats that they hold. There is, I think, a possibility for a second coming for populism, like a better, an upgraded version of populism. You can kind of see hints of that happening globally in terms of a comeback. Political comeback seems to be possible. You have Lula da Silva in Brazil, you have Netanyahu in Israel. Boris Johnson came tantalizingly close to coming back, and Trump saying that he's very, very, very possibly going to run. So there's also the fact that the technocrats have the basic problem that they don't know what they're doing. They don't have solutions to anything. They have no solutions to the immigration problem, because it would entail some really courageous political decisions which they're just not willing to take. And we can see that neither the Tories nor Labour, and I think it's even more shocking that Labour has no even analysis of the doom loop that we're stuck in economically and the fact that we need to try and escape it. So, I mean, that is a window of opportunity, right? But I think that populism needs to be better if it's going to have any chance of actually making a difference. And I think that there's sort of three things. I mean, one thing is, as I've said, it's the policy details, really thinking about, okay, well, what would we do in power? How would we fix the immigration system, for example, and being really honest about what that would take. And I think that either takes, a deal with France, which actually entails taking more asylum seekers through legal means and policing that 100-mile coastline, which could take a lot of resources, or swing to the other side. It's more of a conservative response, which is, frankly, you bring in the military and you do turn back operations, and you accept that there's going to be almost inevitably some loss of life, even if you save more lives in the long term, then, and also, you have to accept that the border force would never agree to do that. It would have to be the military, because they've already said that they would strike rather than do that, which is fair enough. That's their perspective. So that's one thing. The second thing, I think, is values, deciding what the values are, whether it's freedom, self-reliance, outward-looking suspicions. I don't know what it is, but there needs to be more of a discussion of this. And I think one of the problems with liberalism is that it has lost its underlying metaphysic. So I don't know, people have different views of Thatcherism in this room, but one distinction between Thatcherism and the neoliberalism that we have today is that Thatcherism, it had a sort of Judeo-Christian underlying metaphysic, because she was quite a religious person, Methodist upbringing, whereas this neoliberalism, it's very amoral, and it's basically just about the markets supremacy. So how do you then challenge the amoralism of the world and the system that we live in today? And we have to kind of think about what do we actually believe in, and actually an interesting aspect of that, I think, that we need to do better is kind of combating this apocalyptic disposition of neoliberalism, this kind of end of history. Because I think one of the problems that we have is that it doesn't feel anymore like we are sort of links in a chain, and that there's been a past, now we're in the present, and there's a future, and that it's part of our mission, collectively and individually, to leave the planet, to leave society in a better condition than we found it for our children and grandchildren. I think that on an elite level, we're even missing that, and it's just a strange kind of philosophy, a strange kind of attitude. I think we need to fundamentally confront that. And the last point I just want to make is that we need to be very careful not to tip down this rabbit hole of framing the problem like there's an elite cabal who's kind of controlling at all the levers of power, and we just need to overthrow them and then everything will be glorious. Because actually it's much more complicated than that. You're going up against a system, right? It's just not just a collection of people, it's a very resilient system. It's things like self-expanding bureaucracies, self-expanding laws like the ECHR, it's a living instrument. Negative feedback loops, which we see in the economy all the time, which lead to, they blow up, and complex vested interests, which are at all levels of society. So it's everyone from over-leveraged mortgages in the south to hospital managers with their fiefdoms that don't want to relinquish power, and there's even people working in defence who are attracted to sort of big, traditional, expensive infrastructure when we should really be investing in new things. So it's all these things, basically. So I think that there are opportunities, especially if the technocrats do fail in the way that it seems to be looking. However, I think there's a lot of work to be done, and if we actually want radical and productive change in this country. And I hope to be hearing lots of discussions throughout the day about how we can get there. So thank you.
I think it's very easy, isn't it, to get very depressed about the outlook for the short and medium-term future. But I think one of the things we do need to do is, as the blurb for this session says, we need to think historically about the kind of much bigger challenges that our forefathers faced and overcame, collectively using their skill and ingenuity and creativity to make and remake the world. So yes, we can fix Britain, but we mustn't underestimate the task ahead. I've got a 4-part plan, going one above James's 3, 4-part plan to help us drive the country forward. So my 4-part plan is to fix finance, fix infrastructure, fix productivity, and fix politics. So I'm starting with my area first, fix finance. It was really galling, I felt, to hear commentators in the aftermath of the mini-budget suggest that the adult in the room was Andrew Bailey, the governor of the independent Bank of England. As Claire mentioned earlier, the Bank of England given its independence by New Labour back in 1997, and the arguments for that were about politicians being too short-term, too much under the influence of voters, to be trusted with decisions on interest rates and money supply. We really don't want democracy anywhere near those kind of decisions, was the argument. But let's be really clear that it's that technocratic, expert-led Bank of England that has reigned over the massive expansion of quantitative easing that they instigated in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. They've now pumped around £900 billion into saving the banks under that programme. And that money has not largely been used to finance new investment. It's simply bailed out those zombie banks that are still failing, and some zombie companies. But it's also created an asset bubble, which we're now seeing explode, not just in the UK, but overseas as well. And all those problems don't stop with the Bank of England. The private banks also create money in their lending practices. And that money creation, whilst it's controlled to some extent in its level by the Prudential Regulation Authority, there's no control over what that money is spent on. And as we know, that money is often used to finance leverage buyouts by venture capitalist organisations who now own many of our companies. And that creates businesses with high levels of indebtedness, who are vulnerable to interest rate rises and have structures where, of course, interest rate payments rank way ahead of claims for higher wages. Now, a solution to that is to significantly reduce the level of private sector money creation by stricter reserving requirements. Let's allow some of those banks to fail. That would create the space for the Bank of England to increase the publicly created money supply that can be funneled into fixing Britain. And that fixing Britain isn't just about continuing with easy, cheap credit. In fact, I'd want the bank to find ways to support businesses, particularly big businesses, to reduce their reliance on debt and to find ways to support workers who work for those sclerotic, debt-laden businesses with poor productivity, the businesses that we subsidise by paying workers in-work benefits. Let's let those businesses die a death. So fix infrastructure is the next thing. We need to rebuild our industrial base, including transport and utilities infrastructure, and re-establish food and energy security. The first part of any of that rebuilding programme has to be cheap and secure energy. We can get that from UK-owned and built nuclear. I'd also pursue fracking, and for the short and medium term, we should recognise that fossil fuels should continue to be part of our energy strategy. Renewables and hydrogen, of course, can play a part, but we shouldn't imagine they provide a full solution. And we also need to rebuild transport, water, sewage, communications infrastructure across the UK. We need to stop getting people into and out of London, reconnect our local towns and our coastal communities. Revitalising transport shouldn't be about forcing people out of cars, but about providing attractive alternatives. And we need to be aspirational in all this, looking at new technologies that we haven't used in the UK before. Then fix productivity. So we need to drive forward new industries, forging partnerships between governments, our universities and the private sector. That would allow us to address the wage stagnation that's reduced the standard of living of workers and their families. It's interesting that discussion on the cost of living crisis today seems to assume that working people need to pay for the rising level of prices. But in the 1970s, when inflation last peaked, the real disposable income of workers increased. So what's different now? Well, first, there's clearly less power in the hands of workers with far lower levels of trade union membership, especially outside the public services. And so the share of the pie that workers get hold of is decreasing, especially for that squeezed middle. But more importantly, we've been unable to address that productivity puzzle, to grow the pie. If we could massively increase our productivity, we could afford to pay wage rises that reflect the rise in the price of goods. So how do we make that happen? We need a really clear and thought-through economic strategy, and we need to fund and drive innovation in technology and manufacture. And I do think the need for a public discussion on this is being recognised broadly. It's in Keir Starmer's speeches recently, if you wanted to plough through them. Last month, the TUC passed a motion calling for the establishment of a National Commission for Manufacturing. So let's work those ideas up into something more organic, something that isn't just top-down imposed, but one that harnesses the skills and ingenuity of ordinary working people across industry, academia and our communities. And finally, let's fix politics. I don't know about you, but when people do that, name one thing that Brexit has achieved question. My number one on my list is always that it's revealed how shallow, inadequate and cowardly our politicians are. So we have to fix politics. We need to reinvigorate democracy, to re-engage the swathes of politically homeless, many of us I'm guessing here today, and we need to drive out those shoddy politicians and the technocrats and the experts trying to regain control following the populist revolts. For non-metropolitan Britain especially, we need a class-based politics that recognises the common interests of workers. But we shouldn't just be looking to other people to provide that. Whenever I hear people say, government needs to do this, I worry a little that because we need to stop contracting out responsibility for things. We need to start building something ourselves. We need to be braver, more hardworking and more determined. Because it isn't our leaders who will fix Britain, it's us.
I'm Gerard from the British Counties campaign. You've very kindly given us a booth at the front. And I'm there with Pam from Pam's petition, who's just waving her petition up in the air. Right, I've got three very quick questions. Firstly, to the lady who spoke first, well, at least I think it was a lady, who exactly are we fighting against? Okay, that's the question I wanted to ask. Are you Mo, the lady in the middle? Are you the chair, Mo? What pandemic? I'm going to ask you that question. And my last question, I'm going to sort of try and frame
Quickly,
it too.
last one.
Sorry?
Yeah, last one.
Yeah. What's the worst that the markets can do, assuming that we get a really populist leader back in control? What worst that the markets could do? Sherelle very briefly sort of said it was going to be quite difficult to do that.
Yeah.
But that's the question. Thank you.
That's great, yeah.
Just a point about the free market. In 1990, electricity was privatised in this country, and there was something called the dash for gas. I don't know if people remember it, but we effectively took what was being flared off in the North Sea and pumped it into the electricity system. Over about 11 years, there were 39 gas-fired power stations produced, all with private capital, no expenditure to the state. And that came to an end with the Climate Change Act in 2008, where effectively they geared the whole of energy policy towards carbon budgets, in other words, reducing carbon dioxide. And it meant two things. One is that we couldn't take advantage of the fracking revolution that has now made America a net exporter of gas. Just remember, America, despite all the stuff about climate change, is energy independent. They have more oil than Saudi Arabia, and we are now buying their LNG gas. So the Climate Change Act stopped us fracking and taking advantage of that technological revolution that happened in America, all using private capital, all generating fantastic taxes, well-paid jobs, and cheap energy. So I think it's worth bearing in mind that the technocratic control of areas of the economy has destroyed the free market that can actually create huge amounts of innovation. So I'm very interested in the ideas of William and the SDP, but I think it's worth bearing in mind that we would now have the cheapest energy in Europe. We could be exporting LNG out of Immingham and Grimsby to Germany had we allowed the free market to carry on with energy production in the UK.
Thank you.
For a fleeting moment this year, I had a political home again. 44 days of having a political home. 44 days of having a Prime Minister and a Chancellor who actually recognised what the problem was. And they dumped them. I don't see any prospect at all, and I certainly haven't heard anything this morning, although I missed James at the start, so I can't. That may have been all the answers I needed. I haven't heard anything that comes anywhere close to the coherence and sense and radicalism of the agenda that Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng proposed, and I want them back. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think it was Claire Short who used the phrase which brings together all the main points of the four speakers, and that was change the agenda. And it seems to me that the agenda that needs to be changed, as the SDP chairman has told us, the SDP leader has told us, is that we need to stop doing whatever career politicians think is in their interests and the interests of their party, and making decisions momentarily and temporarily on the basis of their own interests. And we should have an agenda which represents the interests of this country. And that, to me, is the economic agenda, the revival of our economy, because none of the wonderful things that any of the speakers have talked about can be achieved, whether it be reform of the National Health Service or better relations with foreign countries so that we can get climate change dealt with or whatever. None of these things can be done if we don't have a serious economy which is not de-developing as it has been for the last 15 years, but is reviving. And the way to do that, it seems to me, and I return to William Clouston and the age of indifference, is to make sure that we have people in politics who are not indifferent to the future of our country and not just concerned about their own careers and their party's survival. And how do we do that? We have to get elected non-career politicians, ordinary people, representative people, the kind of people who voted for Brexit, I would say, and when they get into power and clear off these career politicians, then we have to have constitutional changes which make sure that these kind of people, real representatives, are in power in Parliament in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take one more and then we'll come back to the panel.
Except, my friend, there aren't such politicians available, because most of the politicians across this country opposed Brexit and still largely do. There isn't that empowering political ethos that would underpin the sort of constitutional change you're talking about. And that indeed is a similar problem to the problem that was actually expressed very well by three of the speakers that we heard from earlier. most of them offered technocratic solutions to the problems that they identified as being too technocratic. I'm so glad that it was Hillary who spoke last, who gave the rallying cry which you all applauded, which was that we have to put this right. We can't rely on the state. The state is already too large. It is an historic high proportion of our economic activity. Taxation is already too large. As the commentator on my left said a few moments ago, the right answer is not to tax the people who are making the commercial activity, the productivity changes, the investment. Instead, what we have done is we have seen essentially a sort of market-led coup of the sort of people who are potentially going to provide some sort of answer, finally. On a question of R&D tax credits, which the first speaker was very sceptical about. Commercial corporation tax raises, imperfect tax as it is, 60 billion a year. That is much, much larger than the investment in higher education of 40 billion a year. The activity commercially is where we need to see productivity changes and investment. And therefore, I am very sceptical of the answers offered by William Clewson, the second speaker, who simply wants the state to run more industry. I think we have tried that, friends, and I don't think it works.
Okay, thanks. Panellists, I'm going to ask you to pick up on anything that you want to from there. William, do you want to respond first?
Yeah, there's a huge amount there. So, just on the point about Liz Truss being the answer to our questions, I so don't agree with that. I think, it doesn't matter what the question is, whether it's housing or energy or anything else. Their type of thinking is you just leave it to the market. It is a sort of indifference, and magically the market, like sort of alchemy, is just going to provide you with the answers, and it isn't. And actually, in detail, look at Truss's record. She went over when she was in charge of trade, did a trade deal with Japan, and when it was modelled, it will increase the long-term exports from Japan to us by about 80%, and ours to them by about 30%. In other words, she's just done it because she's a free marketeer. Any trade is good, no matter what's happening to the bilateral trade deficit. It'll make the trade deficit bigger, and you can only pay for your imports in one or three ways. You can export today, you can sell something you already have, or you can issue debt. And that's the blind side. She didn't think about that at all. And it'll make us poorer. I think it's crazy. I think I don't buy into this sort of globalist takeover thing. I think the reason that Kwarteng and Truss failed was they're quite incompetent. Truss did not. How on earth she sort of rose without trace to leading the country, but she didn't have the basic political skills to make a case for anything. Didn't have the basic debating skills. Couldn't even deliver a decent speech. And Kwarteng, didn't even explain what he was doing, and then he surprised that the markets didn't like it. No one knew what was happening. So I think they absolutely weren't the answer, and I think it's the end of that type of thinking.
You don't need to clap them every time. We'll give them a clap at the end. James, is there anything you want to?
Well, one of the problems with toxic masculinity is that men, and actually women, don't listen. I don't remember, to the gentleman who was so sceptical of all speeches in the panel, I don't remember calling for a massive programme of state intervention. I hope you were listening carefully, sir. And nor was I sceptical about tax credits for research and development. I was sad that they weren't picked up enough to the tune of £84 billion. So that atmosphere of magnanimity, now I love the massive opposition the panel's already received, and I even look forward to more, but I ask that it is magnanimous, that it listens carefully, and that it combats me and the other panelists with figures, with news, and not with the prejudices where you come to a meeting and don't listen hard enough to the speakers. Let's not do that. Let's reform ourselves and make sure that we have some good manners. It'd be a change on the left, certainly. The right cannot be the only people upholding good manners. We have to do that. Thank you.
Don't they'll get big heads.
The gentleman at the back asked, who are we fighting? I think my emphasis would be also what. And it really goes back to my point, it's also a system that we're fighting. It's not just a collection of individuals. I want to give two examples. One is this idea of civil servants being against Brexit and change. And I think that it is more nuanced than that. I'm not actually convinced that there are hordes of civil servants out to get Brexit. I think part of the problem is there's too many civil servants, and because there's too many, when they are trying to contribute to their job, they're often making a negative contribution. So thinking of reasons why things can't be done because they want to feel like they're contributing in their job, or saying that, you know, we need to have a meeting about this, and meetings to have meetings to have meetings to have meetings. So it's like, it's a logic, it's the process. And so we need to kind of understand really the dynamics of the system and how it works and why it's so difficult to change things. And so actually one of the aspects of civil service reform which is really important is trying to cut down the numbers, which is very difficult. And I think another example is the markets, which you also asked about. You know, I really don't buy this idea of a market conspiracy. I think that it's a logic. I think it's simply the fact that to the markets, whether the country grows or not is completely irrelevant. So the financial markets, they make money they make crumbs of commission from passing around the pie. They don't care about the size of the pie or growing the pie. And you know, as to the question as to what would happen if a populist came into government, how would the markets react? Well, the markets will simply, if the markets believe that the country is going to default on its debt because it's got somebody in government who can't communicate what their long-term plan is, how they're going to pay for tax cuts and whatnot, then they will have a tantrum and bond yields will spike, and then we'll have the pensions margin calls, and you know, things will come crashing down. And so yeah, it's a very difficult situation, but it's not because there's people out to get the country, it's just the way that the system works, unfortunately. And actually part of one of the real challenges was that with journalists is we have got to find ways of explaining this stuff, because if we don't, then it's just tinfoil hat, you know, elite conspiracies. And I think that is a problem, because if that's how people frame the problem, then we're never going to get solutions. Interesting point about sort of free market versus sort of state solutions. I mean, I think we need to have a more nuanced debate about this, because clearly, I mean, I write for the Telegraph, so I don't think that free markets are the bogeyman by any means. I think free markets are great, but I do think that free markets, as we have seen, have certain blind spots, and they can't fix everything. And I think that it's becoming clear what those blind spots are. So it's things like basic science research, it's innovation, it's, you know, rebuilding the industrial base, R&D. And also high impact, high risk innovation in particular. So, you know, wild and wacky ideas, we don't put enough funding into that. So it needs to be more of a complementary relationship between government intervention, state intervention, and the free markets. And I believe in light touch intervention, but I certainly don't buy this idea that we just let the free markets do their thing, because we've seen what that means. It means an economy which is completely over-reliant on financial services and is prone to systemic implosions, and it's just not acceptable.
Hilary?
Just quickly on the finance issues, I think a lot of discussion about the budget doesn't recognise the fact that actually the thing that I think spooked the markets a bit more was quantitative tightening. So this is the bank trying to sell all that £900 billion worth of bonds that they'd bought back into the market, and I think that was a bigger issue actually than the budget, which just was a bit of the thing that tipped things over the edge. And yes, governments can intervene. I don't think we should buy this, you know, the markets are all powerful, because actually governments can be considering things like, I mean, you know, I agree free trade isn't always the answer. I think we should be thinking about things like exchange controls. We should be thinking about things like trade barriers. We should be thinking about state buys British, you know, and all those things are things government could do, but they've been unwilling. It's not that they're unable to control any of those things, that they've just not been good enough at doing it. And, you know, at the end of the day, you know, whether you like the Tory budget or not, and I didn't particularly, but yeah, I don't think there's actually anything wrong with having a deficit-funded budget. And had the Labour Party been in power, that's the kind of thing they would have done as well. And to say that that's impossible now because the IMF doesn't bloody like it, well, do you know, if that's what we want to do, that's what we should be doing. And there are ways that could be done. I really think it's unhelpful for people like the Labour Party to be so gleeful about the intervention of markets. We should be standing up and saying, actually, whether you like the budget or not, the way we control the budget in the UK is by voting a government out, not by asking the IMF.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for your comments, very interesting. Technocrats love an NGO, and NGOs love a permacrisis. And that's the system I sort of see at the moment. I mean, you kind of haven't said the words NGO explicitly. I know you've kind of skirted around it. But you can program the industry via finance when there's a war on, right? You can redirect public finances to wherever you want them to go, wherever the government wants to go. And they can shape the country and shape industry like that. And that's why we've got a permacrisis. That's why we've got forever wars. So whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan or Ukraine or COVID or climate change, which have themselves been talked about in the language of war. We've got this war, we've got to fight this war. That's when you take the money from the public purse and you dish it out to the elites. And I think that's what's going on. You know, we raise money through bills in Parliament, and then it goes to NGOs, and they decide, you know, who's commissioned for the PPE equipment. Where do the vaccines go? What about the testing equipment? And now we've seen it with military equipment for Ukraine. So my challenge is really that, you know, you can't do any of this lovely stuff that you've been talking about until you dismantle and get rid of NGOs, because let's not forget, they also give a lot of money to the media. And then the media, funnily enough, are on side. And that's why we don't have as much investigative journalism and as much dissent and as much challenge against some of these technocratic ideals, because it's all in the same system.
Hello, my name's Andy Fitton. Thank you for just giving me a moment of your time. I'm here really today as well as to listen, but to also just make a point about something that I think doesn't get aired enough, and it speaks to some of the things the panel talked about, particularly noted Hilary said. We need to stop contracting out personal responsibility to the government. Article 29 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights is very clear. It says everyone has duties to their community only in which their full personal development is possible. In other words, it's all about personal responsibility. This article in the UN Declaration of Human Rights is significantly missing from the 1952 EU Charter. It's also significantly missing from Tony Blair's 1997 Human Rights Act. And I've not read all 400 pages of the latest EU Fundamental Charter of Rights because I kind of have a life, but I'm willing to bet it isn't in there either. So basically, our right to be personally responsible for ourselves has literally been snuffed out at birth. And I think that's a very important cultural icon that we need to bring back. Thanks very much.
Yes, I thought there was loads of excellent points in the introductions, whether it's the numeracy and literacy thing, or the productivity thing, the lack of planning, or the apocalyptic mindset. But the one that I wanted to pick up on and draw attention to was the closing remarks of William, the cultural problem, which I think is really, really important. And I raise it because it's the one that I find most difficult to understand and to explain, but I think it's really actually quite necessary that we do try and get it in perspective, because, William, I agree with you. I think it actually goes much further than you actually outlined, because I think it's something that's way beyond the question of whether firms or production is owned by British companies. And it's actually more a culture wars question than just primarily a cultural question. And it just seems to me that the way we understand ourselves culturally is just so important in terms of the way that we understand the world more generally, and the way that we attempt to tackle the problems with it. And one of the problems that we face with it is, first of all, that people don't admit to the culture wars problem even existing, or they say, oh, well, yeah, it might exist, but the economy is more important, or this or that is more important, so let's not tackle it. But I don't think it can be an optional extra. I think we really need to understand how it affects every aspect of life, whether it's the economy or you see the immigration problem just now, which is definitely framed by the culture wars. You see the problem with the police, schools, you can't teach history, but you're locked into gender ideology. So all of these things are framed by our cultural mindset. And I think that's the one area that we really need to address in order to address all the other aspects that people have talked about this morning.
Thank you.
Hi. I think Claire talked about sort of changing the agenda, and then Hillary talked about it's us who actually can change things. When I look at the politics and politicians there, what the Libs are doing, what the Labs are doing, what the Cons are doing, none of them actually represent what we want to do. So what I want to know is how we sort of individuals, we don't really have, we're politically homeless. How can we, or what can we actually do in order to change things from our perspectives, and how can we actually change the politics in order to sort of make them see what we want to do?
Thank you. Yeah.
What I don't understand is why, okay, we've got a 50 billion deficit. I mean, we've lived with 50 billion deficits for years. Why on earth do we have to sort of be push down a path of austerity, which they're talking about sort of hitting capital gains tax and stuff like this and sort of and whatnot, which, I mean, okay, I could sort of live with that, but I mean, but it will stifle growth, you know, and we know it'll sort of, and it'll make any recession that we end up with being worse. And what I'm really, really concerned about is we get back to the position where we were in the Osborne days, when you've got some of the most vulnerable people in society living in fear over just a couple of billion quid of savings, when sort of everybody else is sort of making a fortune elsewhere, where they're enriching their mates on all sort of different contracts and things. I'm really, you know, it's, I don't know, words fail me, sorry.
That's right. Could we take the mic? I didn't mean to take it off you, by the way. Just down here, thank you. Tamandra, yeah.
I have a friend who grew up in Rostock, which meant that until his mid-late teens, he lived in East Germany. And we were discussing the general state of the world, and I was moaning that the Royal Mail don't seem to feel that delivering mail is a thing they have to do anymore, and train companies don't feel that running trains is a thing they have to do anymore. And he said, you know, this actually really reminds me of the last few years of living in East Germany, because nobody wants to take responsibility for anything. And it really rang true to me. And then I thought, but, you know, what happened? We know what happened there was a kind of a combination of the people who lived there going, we won't stand for this anymore, and the people who were supposedly running things going, well, we just don't care enough to defend it, and it imploded. But what happened there was West Germany went, all right, we'll take you all on, and we've got more money than you, and but the difference here is, of course, we don't have a West Germany waiting to take us on, which arguably is a good thing, unless Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt think they are West Germany, which possibly they do. But that throws open this question. Well, okay, well, you know, if things are crumbling and collapsing and nobody who is supposedly running things can be asked to take responsibility for running them, then how do we organise somebody else to take over and actually take responsibility for running things? And I don't know, you know, everybody else has been also raising this question, but I think this is the huge question that faces us. It's like we're kind of pushing at an open door. I don't know what we'll find when we go indoor, but how are we going to organise to actually go in and propose and exercise something different?
Thank you. Yes.
Can I ask the panel why do you think nuclear power is clean and safe? Of a number of issues. I think they take 20 years to build, so that's 20 years of CO2 emissions building a concrete bunker to sit it in. They take 10 years to decommission, and we've still not got rid of the first lot of nuclear waste that's sat in ponds outside the last one. And then you look at Ukraine, where anybody with a missile that'll reach far enough is now a nuclear superpower. And and generally these nuclear developments seem to be owned sort of like by a third by China. Doesn't seem very secure. But everybody keeps saying, yeah, nuclear power, that's the answer.
I'm quite tempted, panellists, just to keep going with comments and then come back to you for final remarks, and then you can wrap any of those points into them. So keep your hands up if you want to speak, because then I can keep an eye on. Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Jenny Johnson. An inordinate amount of power is vested in supranational entities. How can we reclaim our sovereign state? Why should we trust United Nations, World Health Organization, or World Economic Forum? Because I certainly don't. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
This is just a quick one to William. In your speech, you were talking about we need to get people caring about where things are built, where they come from. Apologies if I missed it, but I don't think we went into how we do that. So it's just a quick fire question to you. Agree, how do we do that? How do we change people from not thinking about where things come from and not caring to actually caring?
One of the reasons why I voted Brexit back in 2016 was because I read a very good book by Chris Bickerton called The Citizen's Guide to the EU. And I watched a few of his speeches, and I listened to a particularly good speech he gave at the LSE. And one of the points he made was how there is a void that exists between ordinary people and politicians, particularly those that hold positions of high office, who feel more responsible horizontally to their counterparts in other member states or other countries rather than to their citizens. So there is this void, and there was a political philosopher called Mer that wrote a book about ruling that void. Now, since Brexit, I haven't seen that void be filled at all, and I still think that our political class view themselves as globe trotters, you know, that like, I'm using the word globalist, but there's still this massive void that exists between ordinary people and the political class who want to be in all these international clubs, and the biggest one, of course, of all was the EU. And I would very much value the opinion of the panellists on this general point.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, and then that one can go to the gentleman right at the back. Yeah.
Just a question. A couple of the speakers have talked about the free market. I don't particularly like the free market, they say, as if it's a thing, as if it's some giant squid with 3 eyes that is controlling anything. I think that the free market is just voluntary decisions of 7 billion people wanting to exchange things and is part of the human condition. Anybody who suggests, I work in local government, that if we put more powers into the state, that somehow you'll get away from creating a new ecosystem in which people voluntarily buy and sell and exchange things. So the free market is just part of the human condition, and any solution has to accept that. I think it's a bit naive to say it can ever really be got rid of.
Thank you. Yeah, green jumper at the back there. Yep.
Yeah, well, I thought the panellists actually were really fantastic, and I thought there were some really good ideas there. But can we fix Britain? And I loved Hillary's ending point, but I think it speaks to this question of the cultural question and who we are, that both William and then Alistair's just said. Because today we're told that we're gammons or COVIDiots or white van man or dumb, racist, stupid, backward. Or people think that you can't trust anyone and nothing that we can do is going to result in a success, and it's always going to be worse, not better. So we can say things like ambition and ingenuity and innovation, but it sounds like it falls on deaf ears because the constant message is that we're mad and bad and dangerous and out of control and not to be trusted. So can we fix Britain? That's incumbent on everyone in this room, the people we speak to, how we put pressure on those elected representatives. And if they can't, even under the pressure of the demos, the power of the people, if they can't do it and step up under that pressure, then we need to step up and say, we will fix these things, we will make them better. Here are the ideas, the numeracy, literacy, democracy, but it's incumbent on us to drive that and change this culture, not just criticise, but go beyond that and say, how can we do this better if they won't?
Yeah, I'd just like to come back to James's opening remarks there and his notional aliens. Usually when aliens come, they ask, take us to your leaders. Right now, I'm not sure where I'd take the buggers. Because the thing is, we've had numerous mentions of the technocrats and the technocracies. Claire mentioned it, the return of the technocrats, and the idea that we had Sunak and Hunt foisted upon us. Now, I don't think it's quite good enough to just keep talking about technocrats, this kind of abstract bogeyman. We know who the technocrats are. The lady up here, the doctor up here mentioned earlier the supranational alphabets, the WHO and the WEF. Now, I don't think we should be putting those institutions, those supranational institutions, out of the frame. I don't think we should be scared from speaking about these people by the threat of going into conspiratorial territory. We have to have this discussion. If these people themselves are saying the things that they are saying, we must take them at their word and challenge them on it.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'm no expert on the British electoral system at all, but it seems, and folks were talking about how we need to get regular people running for office and get these career politicians out, but this British political system doesn't seem like it was built for that. Now, I have British friends who tell me, Rob, how did Trump ever get to be president? He's such an awful this, he's awful that, he says all these things. And I said, he got to be president because he wasn't a politician, because he did say real things. He did come across as a real person, whether you believed in him or not. And I don't know, and y'all could explain this better to me, that how does a regular average Joe get to run for office? I live in Manchester, and I was speaking to somebody who was in office, and I said, I want to run for office. I said, I know what I see, and I think people would, because I speak honestly and I speak the truth, I think people would happily support me. And he explained to me the whole system and the past the post business, and you have to be this and this and this and that. By the time he was done, he talked me out of it. I mean, now maybe that's a good thing for this country. I don't know. But is there a way for some regular folks who can speak honestly and I've been called all the names, and I couldn't care less. They mean nothing. But I think people are desperate for people like that. But the system itself does not seem like it will allow someone like me or a regular person. So maybe y'all can enlighten me on that one.
Great. Yeah, okay, great. The gentleman in the T-shirt at the back there. Yes, sir.
Okay, thanks very much. I enjoyed the panellists. The background to our meeting today, of course, is the COVID pandemic, during which the government spent $500 billion. Whatever happened to democracy during that period, and how can we avoid a mass psychosis event like that again?
Thank you.
Hi, yeah. Basically, I think I want to talk about the one thing that no one's actually talked about, and it's the fact that our children are handled by the state, and no parent at all is actually teaching our children to actually think for themselves. So, like, literally what we're seeing at the moment is just like we see like a lot of like teachers going through literally go through education and don't actually learn anything in real life. For example, we see teachers going from secondary school to sixth form and then on to like university and not actually like going out and actually having a actual proper job and actually figuring out things properly. I mean, this is what I've literally learned from people like Carl Benjamin and things like it's. Like we're not actually actively looking at what our children are actually learning, and instead letting the state teach them certain things and going out into the world with bad values that are actually hurting our system. And I think by actually teaching them good moralistic values is what will help our country in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. Yes, it's a bit facetious, but I'd just like to remind everybody that this is the 5th of November, and maybe Guy Fawkes had an idea. Thank you.
Thank you.
One of the things that I thought was most revealing about Truss was not the fact that she wasn't very skilled at being able to sell the argument, the fact that she didn't have any inclination to. And I think that, for me, that link between democracy and the question of the future seems to me really important. The problem I've got, which I don't know whether the panel can help me with, is that I don't know that we as a public are able to effectively talk ourselves about the economy and how and what growth means and what a productive economy means. So, William, you made the point about steel, that the university is not a fair swap for steel. I could say the same in Nottingham. We used to do drugs, cigarettes and bicycles, but we've now got universities and coffee shops. So I think it's just about, when we talk about productive economy, we think about manufacturing. And I think we maybe need a public discussion about what do we mean to have a productive economy in a developed society where, if you watch the current documentary on iPlayer at the moment about the workers who worked down an Angel tube station, which is a fantastic documentary, all of those people wanted to get out of some of those jobs, and I think they had an expectation of wanting to do better. And I think that thing about wanting to move on is quite a valid aspiration when there's a lot of jobs to do, but people want something better than that.
Hello. Right. So, firstly, as an annoying pedant, I'm going to point out that James listed 4 things that need to happen. The first of which was numeracy, and then announced. No, he listed 3 and then announced 4. So, yeah. But it's better to underpromise and overdeliver. Anyway. So. Second thing is, so in my family we have a saying that's an omelette in a tray, which is about that's like a short-term expedient thing as opposed to driving on through and getting the kind of steak on a plate later type thing. So my question is, how, in terms of as we get on the front foot and push on the open door type thing, how do these things relate to each other? Is it that small local things then achieve the larger, bigger things? Or is there even a tension? Is it either or how do they relate to each other? Do you go for the big and then the small happens?
Great, thank you. Okay, one more very quick one, thank you.
Yeah, my comment was is related to that, actually. I think what we're experiencing at this point in history is exploring the limits of globalization, which I recognise basically as the flow of people, goods, and money around the world in unprecedented ways, and we're now experiencing the limits of that. The answer to it, I think, is that we all have to begin acting contextually, which means if we are near the centres of power, that's our place to act. But for most of us, it isn't, and we're not going to suddenly get there and produce solutions. We've got to begin where we are, like the people who are now called woke. Their ideas were begun 25 years ago, and they had a long view they wanted to change the culture, and they began to do it where they were. And that's what every one of us needs to do. Thinking we can grab a place in Parliament and make a difference is for the birds. Only if you're called to that should you do that. What you should do is, or what we should do, what I'm trying to do in my life and teach my children is act contextually where you are and be the very best you can be. And if that projects you towards the centres of power, then great. But if it doesn't, you'll make a difference where you are. So we've got to live that tension between global and contextual.
Great, thank you. Okay, panellists, I'm going to give you 2 minutes to wrap up. I told you I'd give you extra time, and it was going to be 1 minute, so you've got now 2. Aren't I generous? We'll go in the order in which we started, I think. James, if you are all right to come in.
Well, folks, we do need a new agenda, but we also need a new vocabulary. I tried to interrogate the category. If you take one thing from what I got to say today, interrogate the category. Do we buy the category smart? No, we don't. Do we think that NGOs are just NGOs? You made a good point. Well, the biggest NGO is actually Greg Jackson, who runs Octopus Energy. Also, he runs the energy system in this country, more than the government does. He's non-governmental, but he is the government. Like the media, I would say. So interrogate it. Now, good question on nuclear. I've never claimed that nuclear is clean. Why? Because I don't accept the category clean. I don't accept the people who drove here with an internal combustion engine are dirty, right? And well, that's what we've really got to interrogate the category. You know, in fact, if anything, clean should be replaced by the word China. Because China does panels, it does turbines, it does electric vehicles, it does everything that is thought to be green and clean. And as William says, it does it through slavery in the oh-so-democratic Republic of Congo, right? Interrogate, do the research. And also, excellent point made here about the local and the central. I made the point, people in Buxton, or Buxton as I have it, need to be part of the process of William's planning. They need to be part of economic development. And Churchill was right when he said, trust the people, right? We have to believe, and I do believe, that the people of Buxton have the curiosity, the intellectual capacity to make the difference in a contextual moment like you describe. So I think we can easily get people to understand the question of foreign ownership if we use the right words and if we persuade and if we have confidence in them and finally and most importantly, confidence in us. Can we fix Britain? Yes, we can.
I'm going to use my 2 minutes to try and answer some of the questions that were raised that were interesting. So first on Alistair's point about culture being important, it is massively important. Get a problem like the migration crisis. I've done a number of interviews where I've been asked why isn't it solved, and it's because they don't want to solve it. It's not because they can't, they don't want to. Maybe it's a little bit too difficult at middle-class dinner parties to get out of the 51 convention and so on, but if you did, you can have border sovereignty or you can be in the convention, you can't have both. I know it's difficult, but they don't want to. That's why it's not solved and it won't be solved. Vested interests, very, very important, NGOs and other things. But don't forget just old-fashioned corruption. It exists in our country. On the index, we're not the worst. But look at the housing market. The last electoral commission submission available shows the Tories took about 10 million off the developers. It distorts their policy quite clearly. That's basically corruption in my book. I want to pick up on something that Sherelle mentioned, which is the Brexit coalition. I think that's cooked. I think that's done, finished. I think not even someone like Boris Johnson, who has significant political skills, could keep that coalition together. Why? Because we wanted totally different things. The best, and I would argue the sole idea that many right-wing Brexiters had was unilateral free trade. I personally think that's crazy. Have more of that, you'll wreck the country even more. We wanted on the left something different, protection probably, democracy certainly, and reindustrialization. You can't have both. To the point about how would we get people to reindustrialize? Well, persuasion, partly, persuasion. Getting it onto the agenda. My wife's Australian. You can't buy anything in an Australian supermarket without being said, proudly Australian, family owned. If you want it, you've got to persuade people that way. A lot of young people are receptive to the idea of having having 5 good T-shirts made here, possibly, rather than 50 made elsewhere in poorer conditions. And finally, a lot's been mentioned about the market. My idea is not my idea, but it's the SDP's, which is the social market. I've never asked, I'm very, very pro-market. We are very pro-market. The market is much more efficient at making general goods and services. It's got to be regulated properly. We have cartels, that's not working. But I've only ever asked for the state to do what it really ought to do, which is, in my book, run the railways, the utilities, and build a few houses. I'm not asking for very much. And when the state doesn't get what it should do, we run into problems. That's my case.
Thank you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with the gentleman over there making the point about whether we have reached the limits of globalization. I think we are also starting to realize the systemic risks of globalization that we have to live with, and that has very serious implications for a whole number of things. One is, as someone put it over there, sort of debate over personal responsibility and values. I think we're going to see quite a battle for control of the narrative over values, frankly, because you have an elite which has a very manipulative attitude to conversations about values and personal responsibility, frankly. So on the one hand, with sort of a large welfare state, they're basically saying, we've decided that you're so worthless that we're going to pay you money to stay at home. But on the other hand, when the state makes catastrophic errors and people have to suffer, all of a sudden, I don't know if you've seen the front page of the Times today, but Rishi Sunak saying the state cannot fix all of the problems, so you're on your own, folks. And that's the sort of, so my point is that politicians will bring out that trope of personal responsibility when it suits them, but they won't nurture it when it doesn't. And you know, on the question of leadership, how do you get new leaders? I'm afraid it's a bit of a closed shop. Rishi Sunak is quite an interesting example, actually. He is from the financial world, but he was well connected. So his best friend is James Forsyth, who was a journalist who was able to, introduce him to quite influential people in the Conservative Party, and that's how he got his foot in the door. So it is, you know, it is that. I mean, that's the way that the system works, unfortunately. Unless we have a new party, but that's a different story. The void is also very interesting, and you know, what has changed since Brexit in terms of that void between the elites and the people. I think not much, because the reality is that the elites still subscribe to this idea of the epistocracy. And I think by epistocracy, I mean expert rule, basically. And actually, they're doubling down on that. The more complex the world becomes, the more difficult it becomes to find solutions to problems, more intractable the problems become, the more that they are wedded to this idea that there needs to be sort of a top-down, elite, techno-scientific solutions to everything, which is tremendously destructive. And you have to remember this
Sherelle, I'm going to do a gentle
intervention
of my own, because we're just about to wrap up. One very quick point,
I mean, it was just to say that this is a very ancient idea. It goes back to Plato, the idea that the demos and it being evil, and we can't have messy democracy involved in, you know, higher lofty decisions about how we run the world. And so it's not just a modern phenomenon, it's an ancient phenomenon in our Western civilizational history. So it's going to be very tough to overcome.
Hilary, briefly.
Very brief. So I'm going to duck out by saying the people who had questions about political homelessness, come to the session on that this afternoon. The people who had questions about how do we actually do something activist, come to the session on that this afternoon. The one question I did want to just say a couple of words on is this should we care question. Because I do think that if you just want to, you know, bumble along and we want to have, you know, occasional bouts of austerity where, yes, the poorest are hardest hit by that, then probably we shouldn't care. But actually, I want us to grow more. I want us to build more. I want us to have more. And that's why I think we should care. So, yes, we should care.
Brilliant. Can we give them all a round of applause? Thank you.